Hello everyone, Sidewin here. Today I'm going to be talking about the Thaumaturge class in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. The best way to summarize this class is basically a combination of the Witcher and folk magic, just pulling together random things to defeat their enemies. It's mainly a martial support class, unlike some other martial classes which mainly focus on damage, but it can still handle a fair bit of damage. I just wouldn't make it your only damage dealer. So the overview of the class is for proficiencies, they are an expert in perception, fortitude, and will. They are trained in reflex saves. However, the class frequently focuses on dexterity because of the weapons they tend to use. So that can make up for the lower reflex save. Then, the class has all recall knowledge skills, those being religion, arcana, nature, and occultism, plus 3 additional skills and a number of skills equal to their intelligence modifier. So basically, like the rogue, the Thaumaturge has proficiency in pretty much every single skill. The class is trained in simple and martial weapons and unarmored defense, light armor, and medium armor. Usually you want to use light armor or medium armor because it provides a higher AC because you have no bonuses to unarmored defense. So, essentially what this is saying is you want to have at least some dexterity. Most likely, you could double that up with a finesse weapon, but you don't necessarily have to. And you likely want a little bit of strength in order to protect yourself with a bit of heavier armor or deal damage. And you also want charisma, because the key statistic of the Thaumaturge is charisma. Then on the side here is a list of all of the first level abilities. I'll be covering most of these in this video. So the first one's esoteric lore, then there's the various implements and esoterica abilities, there's the ability to exploit vulnerability, there's empower implement, which essentially just means that you get a +2 to damage for most attacks, because you should almost always be holding your implement. And then you have feats. Okay, so now on to the class abilities. So the esoterica and implements part of this is essentially esoterica is a bunch of random items you carry around. It can be held in the same hand as an implement, so whenever an ability says you will be needing esoterica, in reality you don't need to do anything special if you are already holding your implement, which is a special item which you draw abilities from. I'll be covering these in a separate video because it's a little bit complicated and each one has different abilities. You start with having one implement, and then you gain more as you level. So essentially, what this means is that the Thaumaturge has to use a one-handed melee weapon plus an implement, or they could use a one-handed ranged weapon plus their implement, so like hand crossbows or certain guns. However, you should always be aware of it, because you do need to hold your implement to use almost all class abilities. Then the second thing with esoterica is esoteric lore. The way that works is you can use it to recall knowledge about haunts, which are magical traps, curses, which are usually put on you by either a monster or a specific location, and any creature you might encounter. So esoteric lore can be used to recall knowledge about mummies, dragons, beasts of the wild, and elementals all with one skill, rather than needing nature, occultism, and religion to do the same thing. Unlike every other recall knowledge skill, it uses charisma as a modifier. Most of the other skills use intelligence, 1 or 2 of them use wisdom, but this one uses charisma, which is your class statistic. So this allows for a little bit less separation in your various ability distributions. Plus, from the same ability, you get a bonus feat, dubious knowledge. The way that works is essentially whenever you recall knowledge, which you'll be doing a lot as a Thaumaturge, if you fail, you get 1 piece of correct information and 1 piece of incorrect information, or you get a piece of information but aren't exactly sure how important it is. So this kind of depends on how mean your DM is, or on what creature you're recalling knowledge on. But you should be aware of that every time you get a failure on your recall knowledge as a Thaumaturge. Okay, so the exploit vulnerability action is probably the main level 1 ability and the basis of most of later Thaumaturge abilities. The way it works is it's a one-action ability where you roll esoteric lore versus a standard DC of a creature's level. You have to target a specific creature. So if you're fighting a group of werewolves, you have to target one werewolf. If you're fighting a vampire and a bunch of skeletons, you can either target the vampire or one of the skeletons. But you can only ever have one target. This is important on a failure. So the way that exploit vulnerability works is once you've made your roll, if you critically succeed, you learn every resistance, weakness, and immunity of the creature. Your attacks also become magical versus it, and you can use either option, mortal weakness or personal vulnerability, shown here. I'll cover these after I go through which ones give which. On a success, you learn the highest weakness, and your attacks become magical. You can use either mortal weakness or personal vulnerability. On a failure, you can only exploit a personal vulnerability of the enemy. Your attacks are magical versus it, but you can only use personal vulnerability. On a critical failure, you are left flat-footed until a turn passes or so. Usually you will fail, succeed, or critically succeed, so you don't need to worry too much about that, and you should use the ability quite freely. So the way mortal weakness works is when you choose to use it, your weapon attacks activate the highest weakness of the enemy and all enemies of the type. So the example given is if you're fighting a werewolf and you have a, say, set of shavings of silver, you could attach that to your weapon and then you get to deal silver weakness versus the enemy without having a silver blade. And it works against all werewolves. However, the same solution wouldn't necessarily work against Fae, because then you'd have to exploit vulnerability again. Where if you don't get mortal weakness, you have to use personal vulnerability. The way this works is you exploit just the one enemy. So you might still be using silver shavings, but instead of being able to hit any werewolf, you can only hit that one werewolf you targeted. And it gives the enemy weakness equal to 2 plus half your level versus just your attacks. Both of these only apply to your attacks, they don't assist your allies. However, because you learn the knowledge about it, you can share that with your allies to give them the similar benefit. That's why succeeding and learning the highest weakness can be useful. Because if you're fighting, say, trolls, you might not know that they have a very high weakness to fire, but then if you do now know it, you can tell your primal caster, hey, maybe you should use fire spells and deal additional damage. That's why the Thaumaturge is mainly a support class. Because in reality, its attacks won't deal the large damage, and the implement abilities aren't usually damage increasing. Alright, so now I'll go into the feat options available at level 1. So, as you can see here, there's 7 options. I'll just state quickly that the familiar one I am not familiar with, so I won't really be talking about it except to say it gives you a familiar, and that works the same as any other familiar ability given by a class. Okay, so the first feat to mention, aside from that one, is Ammunition Thaumaturge. This lets you reload a ranged weapon with the hand holding your implement. So if you're using, say, a hand crossbow and your implement, then you can reload it with the hand holding your implement rather than having to put away your implement, take out the bolt, and reload. This gives you additional action efficiency and makes it so that your abilities work better with your weapon. Haunt Ingenuity is basically the same thing as the rogue's Find Traps feat, except it works against magical traps, which are, again, they're called haunts. So the way it works is as you're walking through an area, the GM rolls a secret roll for you to detect haunts when you aren't searching. Usually you have to be searching to detect them, but this feat basically makes it so that you don't have to be. You're always alert. Then it lets you disarm haunts with 1 level lower proficiency than you would usually need. For instance, if a haunt requires expert proficiency in Arcana, and you only have trained, you can still try to disarm it using this feat. Scroll Thaumaturge is a special ability that lets you use scrolls as a Thaumaturge. You're not really a caster, but this can let you get pretty close. The way it works is basically you can use scrolls from any tradition. Doesn't matter whether it's arcane, occult, primal, or divine. You can use all of them. And the spell DC for the scroll is your class DC. You can also use your scrolls with your implement hand, so you can be holding a weapon, a scroll, and your implement at the same time. Divine Disharmony is a feat which is slightly special in that it works against anything, but works best against certain enemies. So it's a one-action ability where you roll Deception or Intimidation versus the will DC of a target. Now the special thing is, the way it essentially is flavored is you're shoving together two divine symbols of opposing alignment. For instance, taking a sculpture of Iomedae and Descari and shoving them together. This offends targets which are divine. So you get a +2 bonus on your roll against them. So that's like angels, demons, clerics, or anything like that. However, the disadvantage is that anti-theistic enemies are immune. So if the enemy utterly despises gods, then your ability might have no effect just because, well, they don't care that you're committing blasphemy. Aside from that, though, on a success on your roll, you apply flat-footed condition until the end of your turn, versus your attacks. It doesn't necessarily apply to your allies' attacks. On a critical success, that flat-footed condition extends to your next turn. Diverse Lore is a feat which lets you extend your esoteric lore to recall knowledge on any topic. However, on topics aside from the aforementioned curses, haunts, and monsters, you take a -2 penalty. Additionally, the feat, and this latter part is possibly more useful, it lets you add recall knowledge to your exploit vulnerability checks. Basically, every time you roll exploit vulnerability, you also get a roll recall knowledge. And if your recall knowledge is above the required DC for the creature, then you get to have both effects at once. This only applies if you succeed on your exploit vulnerability, or if you critically succeed. The final feat option is Root to Life. This is a 1 to 2 action ability. The way it works is with one action, you can immediately stabilize a dying creature. With 2 actions, you can also roll repeated DC 10s to remove persistent damage affecting your ally. So that is all with this video. I will be releasing a separate video on implements shortly after this one. I encourage you to watch it if you are planning to play a Thaumaturge. Thank you for watching this video.